very simple, straightforward explanation, which is the colonial legacies. And of course, a lot of people say, well, come on, colonialism is over. It's been, several decades since independence. But we have the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. That was the role we played during colonial times. And unfortunately, that is the role we continue to play today. All the intervention and quote unquote technical assistance and aid and cooperation we've seen from the global north has resulted in debt traps, has resulted in economic entrapment, have resulted in reproducing the colonial structures that they imposed on us as the place for cheap raw materials, as the consumers of their technology, and as the place where they outsource the obsolete technologies that they no longer need. China, on the other hand, came in with its standard foreign policy approach, which is we will not intervene in your internal affairs and we will not tell you what to do. And that puts the responsibility of cooperation really on our governments to decide for themselves the terms of engagement, the terms of cooperation. And I think we have to be very honest here that our governments have not organized themselves well enough to get the most advantage out of China's cooperation and presence in the global south.
Hello everybody, welcome to Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. As the world is undergoing major changes, it's more important than ever to understand the crises, risks, and opportunities that are facing the global south. And I would like to start by telling the stories of Africa, the second largest continent with 1.2 billion population. According to the IMF World Economic Outlook, of the top 20 economies that are projected to experience the fastest growth rate in 2024, 9 are African countries. The continent is the second fastest growing region after Asia, and there are so many cooperations between Africa and Asia. For example, a major forum between China and Africa will take place from September the 4th to September the 6th in Beijing, the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, also known as FOCAC. So I will make several videos about China-Africa cooperation, share with you why it's important, inviting scholars from both Africa and China to share their insights. And I will also go to FOCAC as a reporter to help you see the forum up close. And today, I invited a scholar from Tunisia who is dedicated to finding an alternative development vision for Africa. Joining us now from Malawi is Fadhel Kaboub. He is the senior advisor with PowerShift Africa, Associate Professor of Economics, Denison University in the United States. He's also the president of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Fadhel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show. My pleasure.
So my first question to you is, can you tell us the current challenges that Africa is still facing? Because apparently decades after liberation and independence, and despite Africa is projected to be the second fastest growing region, still a large population in the continent are still lack of food, lack of security, all kinds of challenges are facing so many countries. So what led to those challenges? What caused those challenges?
There's a very simple, straightforward explanation, which is the colonial legacies. And of course, a lot of people say, well, come on, colonialism is over. It's been, several decades since independence. But we have the unfinished business of decolonizing economic structures. And so I focus on the economic structures that actually produce the results that we're looking at. So when it comes to the colonial role that was imposed on the African continent, it can be summarized in 3 basic points. Number 1, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number 2, we were supposed to be the place that consumes technology and industrial output from the global north. We still play that role today. And number 3, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, technical assistance, all of that. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. That was the role we played during colonial times. And unfortunately, that is the role we continue to play today. So colonialism of course, was not a system for development. It was not designed to achieve sustainable development goals or a just transition or justice or anything. Colonialism was a system of extraction, of abuse. And we should not be surprised that the same colonial structures, economic colonial structures that persist today, are producing these bad results of malnutrition, of poverty, of socioeconomic exclusion. So that's why, in the context of the just transition and the context of decarbonization, we always say we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And when it comes to kind of the visible manifestation of these problems, the issue of external debt, that is debt denominated in foreign currencies, in dollars and euros. It is a serious problem because it takes a huge amount of fiscal policy space that doesn't allow our governments to invest in the building blocks of development and prosperity, such as basic health and education and infrastructure, because we have to prioritize paying the external debt. But external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that have colonial roots. Number one, food deficits. Number two, energy deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits. And I can explain each very briefly so we can understand why these are fundamental. When I say food deficits, according to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa today imports 85% of its food. 85%. When less than 100 years ago, during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And what happened is that there's a redesign of the system as soon as we gained independence. In 1955, for example, in Europe, at the Treaty of Rome meeting, the Europeans said we have a food security problem for Europe because they were so dependent on Africa. And that introduced the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day. So what is CAP? It's heavy agricultural subsidies to produce the core crops in Europe, such as corn and wheat and soybean and the core food security items. And of course, it wasn't just Europe that did that. It was the United States, Canada, Australia, the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine today dominate the grain industry. And what it did is that it forced African farmers out of business because they couldn't compete with the subsidized wheat and corn coming from the global north. So we had to redesign our agriculture to specialize in cash crops for exports: coffee, tea, tobacco, bananas, all the complementary items. So today we live in a world where we consume what we don't produce and we produce what we don't consume. And that's why we have real food insecurity on the African continent and the rest of the global south, obviously. So that's the food deficiency. Number two, energy deficiency. When I say energy deficits in Africa, I include our biggest oil exporter on the continent. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline, not by accident, by design. Angola, our second largest oil exporter, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. So we're constantly denied the technology processing, the technology for drilling, the technology for refining. So we export crude oil, we import refined petrochemicals. You export the cheap stuff, you import the more expensive stuff. So you're always in a deficit situation. And finally, the manufacturing deficits, the fact that the only type of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with the value-added content of what we export is low value added, what we import is high value added. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. And here's how it's manifested. You have these structural deficits, the most fundamental areas. As you know, no country can function without food, without fuel, without manufacturing. So we have structural trade deficits, and what structural trade deficits do is that they weaken our currencies relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything I need to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, you import it at a higher price. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy, therefore hurting the most vulnerable people in society. And that immediately forces our governments into a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, which makes sense to protect the vulnerable, but you can't do that for 8 decades. And we ask our central banks to stabilize the exchange rate, to fight inflation. And the way they do it is by using a band-aid solution, which is borrowing more dollars. And that gets the external debt into a vicious cycle that is unsustainable, which means now the government is completely obsessed with prioritizing economic activity that will allow us to earn dollars as quickly as possible so that we service the debt. And we deprioritize economic activity that is actually transformational, that is actually the foundation of development and prosperity. And that is the essence of why we neglect so many of the priorities. And that's why a lot of the fiscal policy space that our governments have is dedicated to servicing the debt, which is by design the colonial architecture that was imposed on us. So that's why we say we can't really achieve the sustainable development goals or a just transition or any of the goals that we want to achieve under a system, an economic system that's still structurally colonized when we have economies that are technically steered from abroad.
I think after independence and liberation, I think different countries have stepped up with the different enterprises from their countries or international organizations step up with the donations in food or all kinds of supports. So different countries, different international organizations have stepped up, involved with Africa. Why those options offered by these countries and these international organizations haven't solved those problems for Africa?
Very good question. I'm glad you mentioned food aid, because Africa didn't need any food aid day one after independence, because we had plenty of food surplus actually to export to the rest of the world. But what happened as soon as agricultural subsidies started in the global north, our farmers, the farmers that used to produce wheat and corn and barley, the core crops, stopped producing them. So it created temporary disruption in the production of core food items because they started prioritizing exporting coffee, tea, tobacco, and the other complementary items that they were able to sell to the global north. And that created shortage of real food items. The food security was disrupted. And the concept of food security was actually invented during that time period. And that's why I always say the concept of food security is a very dangerous colonial term. Because, at the surface level, who doesn't like food security? It's a good thing. But this is a technical term. Food security means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing it yourself or by buying it from abroad or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers because they can't compete with free food. And that food aid completely killed our food sovereignty. And that's why today we talk about the importance of restoring food sovereignty. Whereas the global north, when they talk about Africa, they say Africa needs more food security. And I say, we don't need more food security. Thank you very much. We need food sovereignty. We need to produce our own food. And that is really the crux of the problem. So the reliance on international trade for food security is one of the most dangerous things that happened after independence. And it didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. So this is the colonial and post-colonial design that we need to undo with something like regional food sovereignty programs or continental food sovereignty programs that are designed to support the farmers that produce the food, rather than the current system, which is what we currently do is we subsidize consumers so that they can afford the imported food. When technically speaking, when you subsidize consumers to buy imported food, we're technically subsidizing the producers abroad to continue dominating the global economy.
Mm-hmm. What about the options by other countries? Europe, United States, Japan, different developed countries also have their companies in Africa. So have they made any difference?
Well, I'll start with the big financial institutions that were supposed to, deliver development and technical assistance, such as the World Bank, for example, and to some extent the IMF. When you look at the majority of African countries in the last, 80 years of operations of the World Bank and IMF, and since independence, most of our countries have been under a World Bank and IMF program essentially continuously. with these institutions dictating the conditionalities of how their funds are used internally. In other words, micromanaging our economic priorities. The fact that we're in a debt crisis today means one of two things. It's either that these institutions are completely incompetent and should be rejected, or that their intervention has been intentional entrapment to keep us in a debt trap. And when you look at the creation of the World Bank and the IMF after World War II, most of the continent, the vast majority of the continent, was still colonized. We're talking about the global economic architecture that was not designed by us, that was not designed for us. It was designed for colonial purposes, extraction purposes. Why do we expect these same institutions that haven't fundamentally changed to deliver any different results? So it's time for us to wake up and realize that these are the fundamental pillars of the global economy that need to be decolonized. And I'll give you one number that your viewers will probably remember after this conversation, which is the following. If we divide the world today into global north and global south countries, and if we net out all the financial transactions that happen globally, trade, foreign direct investment, interest payment, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows, all the financial transactions, the net amount, the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to global north. That is the result of the net neo-colonial wealth extraction from the global south. And that number 20 years ago was $500 billion. We thought it was outrageous. And then it became $1 trillion. And today it's $2 trillion. And it's going to keep accelerating because we haven't changed the design of the global economic architecture that was designed for extraction of wealth from the global south. So these are the fundamental conversations that we need to have with the global community, that we cannot expect a just transition or decarbonization or any kind of transformation without transforming these persistent colonial structures.
Next, I really want to address, because next month in September, there's something major for major meeting for China and Africa, because from September the 4th to 6th, the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is also known as FOCAC, will take place in Beijing. And delegates from all African countries will come to Beijing and meet with the Chinese policymakers to set the future goals for the cooperation. And this FOCAC meeting existed since 2000, already 24 years. So a lot of concrete results we've seen those concrete results affecting both continents. So from your perspective, what's the difference from China's involvement with Africa compared to traditionally those Western countries? What's the difference between China's involvement with Africa and the Western involvement with Africa? And do you have any expectations? What's your vision for this forum?
Yes, well, there's a clear difference between the engagement of China in the African continent and the rest of the global South via the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI program, for example, versus what we've seen from the global north, from OECD countries. First of all, there's one clear distinction, which is that the global north countries have been the colonial powers in the past. China was not. So that's a huge difference. Number two, all the intervention and quote unquote technical assistance and aid and cooperation we've seen from the global north has resulted in debt traps, has resulted in economic entrapment, have resulted in reproducing the colonial structures that they imposed on us as the place for cheap raw materials, as the consumers of their technology, and as the place where they outsource the obsolete technologies that they no longer need. So that is undeniable that has been systematically the engagement of the global north with the African continent. China, on the other hand, came in with its standard foreign policy approach, which is we will not intervene in your internal affairs and we will not tell you what to do. And that puts the responsibility of cooperation really on our governments to decide for themselves the terms of engagement, the terms of cooperation. And I think we have to be very honest here that our governments have not organized themselves well enough to get the most advantage out of China's cooperation and presence in the global South. And I've heard it directly from Chinese officials who are saying, we're willing to provide financing, technical assistance, even transfer of technology, but you have to tell us on what terms and what is this. So I'm going to use this opportunity through your program as not as a politician. I'm not a politician or diplomat. I'm an independent African expert to offer what I call the bargain of the century between Africa and China. For the following reason, for true decolonization and transformation of the African continent, and for a repositioning of the global South in general at the center of a new economic and geopolitical international economic order. And the idea is the following. Notice that Africa and the rest of the global South, we essentially have all the critical minerals that the rest of the world is panicking about and wants to have access to. These are the minerals that form the basis of the economy of the 21st century. And we know that. The only country that has mastered and dominated the technology of processing critical minerals today is China, to the point where the US and Europe are actually dependent technologically on refining critical minerals by China. Now, if we want to industrialize as Africa or as the global South, we're not going to partner with countries that don't have the technology. We have to partner with countries that actually have the technology that we need. So I offer that the African continent as a bloc, not as individual nations, offers the bargain of the century to China and says, look, we have the youngest labor force on the planet, on the African continent. We have all the critical minerals that we need to industrialize, to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure for the 1 billion people in Africa who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure, mostly women and children, of course, and clean public transportation infrastructure to link our economies. Just these three industrial policies will completely transform the continent and reposition Africa at the center of a new international economic order. But we lack one thing, which is access to this life-saving technology that Europe and the United States and Japan have, but also China has. For example, the entire value chain for manufacturing solar panels, using our materials, using our labor. So why would China accept this offer? Here's what we offer in return. In 10 to 15 years, China can double its industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, China can double its geopolitical weight globally and secure access to these precious minerals that everybody wants to have from the African continent. But there's one more thing that is extremely important in this particular geopolitical moment, which is China's excess productive capacity, both human productive capacity and technological industrial productive capacity, is at risk at this moment because Europe and the United States are closing their markets to Chinese EV and Chinese high value added manufacturing products. And we know that is happening as we speak. Africa alone and the rest of the global South, our internal market is much bigger than Europe and the US combined. So China has an opportunity to engage with a much larger consumer market. The only problem is we don't actually have the purchasing power to buy those EVs from China. But if we truly industrialize and develop, we will have the purchasing power. We will have the biggest consumer market to engage with China. And that allows China to continue the expansion of its research and development and industrialization, but this time with full engagement with the global South. Now, I know that China will accept this offer. I call on African leaders to actually get together and formulate a joint industrial policy and engage with China for this real partnership that is mutually beneficial for both sides. Now, just triggering this process of engagement in real industrialization with China will give Africa the second bargaining chip that we need to reset the conversation with the global North. And now we can go to European countries, OECD countries, and say, look, we want you to have a similar joint venture partnership with us, just like the one we just had with China, to transfer, say, technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology on our terms, non-colonial, non-extractive terms. We want high-speed rail technology. We want pharmaceutical technology, the building blocks of development. And if they say, no, we OECD countries, we don't transfer technology, which is technically what they do. They don't transfer technology. We don't engage in these types of partnerships. We only do extractivism. We only do neo-colonial engagement. They say, okay, you can keep your technology. We'll give the opportunity for China to triple, quadruple its economic and geopolitical weight and secure its access to these critical minerals, because China also can transfer wind turbine technology, high-speed rail technology, all the technology that we actually need for the building blocks. So, of course, the idea here is not necessarily to shut down half the world, but to actually force them to engage on more reasonable terms. And that allows us to reposition the global South at the center of a new economic and geopolitical international economic order. And coincidentally, this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order that the global South, brought to the UN 50 years ago, and under UN resolutions in UN meetings, and saying we need to finish the business of decolonizing the global South. And that is precisely the process that was shut down by the global North 50 years ago. And that's our opportunity today as Africans, as people of the global South, is to take advantage of this small window of opportunity that we have because of the current geopolitical, economic, and also technological moment. The fact that everybody's really relying on these critical minerals to finally reposition and fully decolonize our economic structures.
Tell us, where can people find your work?
Well, the report that you're referring to, the Just Transition report, which is published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, is available online in English and in French. The website is justtransitionafrica.org. And people can find me on social media. I'm available. I write a Substack blog called Global South Perspectives. So you can find it, and I write frequently short and accessible pieces about the kind of work that we're doing to reposition the global South, to decolonize the global South in the way that I just described today. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you. I will also put Fadhel's newsletter and his account in the description. So thank you so much for this wonderful interview. I really hope you can come back again and again to share with us more of your knowledge on Global South. So thank you so much. I hope you have a good time in Laos and in your next destination.